I'm not typically one to make assumptions, but if the volatility of strangers on the internet is anything to go by, my line of work must have a lot more societal and cultural importance than I initially thought. And if being berated and insulted in every language from English to shapespeak is the price of convincing people video games are sports and art now, then I suppose it's my cross to bear. I think that perspective makes the fact that nobody will be upset by me saying 2017 was one of the best years ever for gaming Americans even more impressive than it already would be. And since whittling a list of the best games released down to only 10 wouldn't be doing that fact the justice it deserves, I've decided to make an exception to my usual preference not to include any honorable mentions. That said, I'm still going to need you to bear in mind that I don't own these, so I haven't played these. Not because I have few enough things in my life to feel proud of, I just can't justify buying game consoles over paying rent. And hey, while I'm making sure I've got the bases covered, I just want to remind everyone that, being God, everything I say in this video is 100% pure objective fact. And if you disagree, a gang of chimpanzees will break into your house while you're sleeping to beat you to death with monkey wrenches, and they'll start with your mouth so you can't even correct them. Something I've noticed happening in years like this is that smaller, simpler, but fundamentally solid games tend to get left by the wayside to make room for the bi-monthly re-release of Christ, and put that way, it isn't exactly hard to see why. It's perfectly natural to draw a direct line of comparison between every gaming experience, since being sold on the same digital Walmart shelf means they all have the exact same goals in mind. Compound that with any kind of superficial similarity, and it's going to be hard to get eyes on any game that lacks a baseline following or doesn't openly ape something people are already familiar with. All it takes to see this is to look at something like Splasher. If I was looking for a stage-based 2D platformer centered around rescuing things from a mad scientist with an unlimited budget for animal-shaped robots and finding the fastest method of completing this sentence because you already know its destination. The problem isn't even a direct comparison kind of thing. Nobody is seeing Splasher and going, pass, can't draw pregnancy out of this, because even at a fleeting glance, it's clear that the games play nothing alike and you could. The problem is that nobody is seeing Splasher in the first place. It isn't the most incredible overlooked 2D platformer of all time or anything, but it's an extremely well-focused one. Nothing ever comes across as gimmicky. If a level introduces a new element, then it's because the developers knew how to make it work in tandem with everything else and planned to build around it. And I'll be the first to admit that not gimmicky is about the last piece of praise I expected to level at a game where you platform the same way Pollock commits theft. The focus even starts with their introduction. Accessing new levels requires you to interact with their mechanics in the hub world in a carefully prescribed order to ensure that you can easily intuit everything the moment you're dropped into the action. It's pretty impressive just how much mileage Splash Team was able to get out of bouncy and sticky ink, and with how well everything ramps up and interacts with those mechanics, it's easy to forget that that's basically your entire moveset. The ironically spotless design, pacing, and wealth of speedrunning features would be enough to earn the game a recommendation on their own, but the fact that there's a demo makes it hard to come up with excuses not to give it a shot if you like this type of thing. Playing a simple, well-made platformer that was so singularly focused on its core mechanics was oddly refreshing, even in spite of the gameplay, art, comedy, music, story, and stealing from Portal that feel like every other game you'd scroll past on the Xbox Live Arcade in 2009. Ironically, looking like every single game on an entire distribution platform is actually what made it stand out to me in the first place against the current indie scene of 500,000 modern analogs for every game released on the GameCube, SNES, and N64. Because going in circles and spiraling are very different trajectories. I'll admit that I'd probably be a bit less jaded about this if it was a nostalgia that I could personally buy into, but my parents loved me, so the only Nintendo console I ever owned was the Wii. Probably explains why the thing that's excited me the most out of this reflective period is the sudden resurgence of the 3D platformer. Not gonna lie, I got a bit sick of one of my favorite genres effectively being boiled down to set dressing for action games with shithouse simplex climbing segments to ensure that everyone knows some gruff white dude voiced by one of the many masks of Nolan North is fucking sick. It's probably a big part of why it's so easy to look past a lot of the problems in something like A Hat in Time. It's been so long since I've played a proper 3D platformer that I spent a while just reminiscing on how good these games can be when they're done right, even if only mostly. Don't get me wrong, the platforming in a vacuum feels great, but I don't have the self-control necessary to avoid giving it a scathing recommendation for how poorly it capitalizes on its actual premise, or more accurately, how poorly it establishes one to begin with. The majority of the titular hats are too context sensitive to add anything particularly interesting to the platforming challenges, so they always have to fall back on the base jumping mechanics, which is made even more disappointing by the fact that the time portion of the title only refers to the aesthetic of making the important story collectibles hourglasses, as the only time-related hat you get in the entire game is a late-game completionist item that just acts as a break the platforming sequence button. You could call it a hat in sand and nothing would be out of place, which is sad because time manipulation hats that could freeze, slow, or speed up moving objects and enemies would have been way more interesting than the mostly shallow ones that the game is filled to the brim with. Not to mention that the decision to make the main hat a show me the objective button seems to have resulted in very little thought being put into the direction of the levels themselves, both in their disinterest to guide the player through the open areas with their design, and in how poorly everything within them is reasoned out on a micro scale. My friend B-Mask already made a really good video on this, so to avoid rehashing everything he says, I'll keep this quick. A Hat in Time's worlds, characters, and creatures aren't typically reasoned out in ways that congeal creatively to the point where they're either particularly interesting to explore or to think about as places. Yeah, a lot of the levels are fun sandboxes to play around in, and the Snatcher's great, but unless your target audience is cats, I think that's more a starting point than a final destination. It's worth noting that I'm only bringing this stuff up because the platforming mechanics, while not exactly setting the world on fire, do genuinely feel great to play around with and are a sturdy enough foundation to support a lot more than what's been built here. I know, complaining about writing and narrative cohesion in a 3D platformer should probably land me on a list with the people who are a bit too into this one, but it's the biggest reason a game with this much character and personality can also be so lacking in identity, at least in terms of its creative syntax. I think they know it's an issue as well, considering how much more work they've put into this stuff in the game's DLC. Nyaku's applause in particular is exceptionally well thought out when compared to anything in the base game. Having the Empress's influence permeate the entire area makes it feel much more tightly knit and considered as a concept, and it makes the life lore a post breathes into that character seep into the level itself as a direct result. This area being improved so much gives me really high hopes for this game's inevitable sequel, because even though it was scripted in MLA format, the character interactions and moment-to-moment gameplay were enough to keep A Hat in Time from feeling like it's standing on the shoulders of giants. Probably. Let me put it this way. It wouldn't exactly have been shocking for Gears for Breakfast to match the aesthetic and gimmicks of some existing franchise and drop anchor on its coattails. And it's sad how common that method of throwing back to older games is, with how interesting even extremely basic platforming and combat mechanics can be made through something as simple as good framing. A jump, wall jump, attack, and featherfall feel like the minimum baseline for any platformer on the market, but presenting those mechanics the way that something like Caves of Qud does shows just how much mileage you can get out of the simple stuff with considered design and a bit of artistic flair. The way it lays out and structures the map to stack the platforming challenges on top of themselves as you unlock more and more options is great, and the act of exploring them is always enjoyable if you get into the aesthetics and talk to the weird, rambling NPCs. It's also impressive how diverse the boss fights are, considering how limited your moveset is, but I doubt any of that would have stuck out to me if it wasn't all framed as an optional minigame found inside an arcade that seemingly exists solely to present a juxtaposition against the drab and depressing world that Dujana occupies, while also managing to never feel out of place. It follows that the stuff in arcades would look and play like this when you've spent the rest of the game interacting with the depressing Dadaist outside world, although I don't think I could lay quite the same level of praise on Pyre or Harmadillo. Unfortunately though, Dujana is the sort of game that I think you can only effectively talk about very briefly or forever, based on whether or not the other party has played it, and since nobody did, I'm just gonna leave it at, this game is interesting and more people should check it out, and if you're one of those people, you can probably tell by looking at it. I should probably also disclaim that if you'd rather avoid games with any kind of politics and just chill out by dropping chemical weapons on Kevin from Math to make him do the funny white phosphorus dance, then this filthy art game where shit comes down to individual interpretation probably shouldn't be on your radar. But longtime viewers will know that my comfort zone is colon-shaped, so I'm not going to miss an opportunity to get a few more hands on it. Or eyes, I guess, since most of the gameplay consists of walking around talking to people and exploring the psychedelic world. And while the part of me that played Caves of Qud tells me that might have been a missed opportunity, the part that played Cities of the Doomed hasn't woken up from his celebratory bender yet. Honestly though, while it works well for what Dujana is going for, I wish more games could find ways to incorporate more compelling gameplay loops into their storytelling. Just look at how much mileage a game like Hellblade can get when it puts the effort into telling so much of the story through its gameplay, and since I've started to taste copper when I say that, I'm just gonna call it ludotography from now on and pray that someday some poor etymologist has to source its origin from a sentence that ends with the word cunt. Some of the ways this is done are pretty obvious, like the puzzles where Senua has to overcome obstacles born from her psychosis by finding innocuous patterns in the surrounding areas and blah blah blah, this doesn't need explaining. The part I really want to talk about is something that I think fucked with a lot of people's perception of the game as a whole, namely its combat. I've heard a lot of people say that it's either bad because it's trying to be a movie or bad on purpose in order to make you empathize with Senua's struggles by making it bad for you too, and both of these people are wrong because the combat in Hellblade isn't bad, it's just designed for an action game that is not a power fantasy. Due to the game's nature, it makes sense that your options in combat are going to be fairly limited compared to its contemporaries, since air juggling sinuous demons to a metal soundtrack while a man yells would sort of undermine the hopeless oppression their presence is meant to provide. Balancing that feeling with a video game combat system is a tightrope walk at the best of times, and in spite of its issues, I still found it decently engaging, and the different strings of choices offered to me kept things interesting without ever making me feel comfortable on my own 2 feet. Sure, it's a bit lacking in complexity, but when people will kiss the taint of Batman Bop It for a decade and then turn around and call this bad, it's pretty clear that their issue isn't a lack of complexity, it's the fact that you don't feel like a badass when it's all over. You know, the point and all that. The primary catharsis Senua gets in this game doesn't come from beating up the brain men because that's what she has to do, not what she's here for, and the combat works alongside everything else to communicate that. What makes a combat system good is entirely dependent on everything that surrounds it, and Hellblade's approach is pretty damn great under that lens, if a bit lopsided. This critique in particular reminds me of all the times I've heard people complain about the glacial pace of the first half of Night in the Woods, apparently not realizing that basically nothing the game is going for works if you quote-unquote fix that. Look, I get that I may have been kinder to this game than some people think it deserves, and I even get why someone would hate it, but the whole point of the segment in that video where I talk about my experiences dropping out and dealing with depression wasn't me trying to get people to feel bad for me. It was to explain precisely why I was so unapologetic in loving it. I can directly relate to escaping what felt like a prison designed to drive me legitimately insane, only to find that my newfound freedom left me miserable and directionless with very little idea of what I could do to improve anything. And while I'm pretty sure I single-handedly closed an entire Applebee's franchise just by saying that, it's the truth, and I'm not gonna pretend otherwise. For the game to capture that, it really needs to make you understand what it means to feel like an outsider in your own life, and how that would lead you to questioning if there was ever any point in being anything at all, and whether or not you ever were to begin with. It gives everything room to breathe and leaves you to suffocate in the mundane horrors of life and constantly prick you with the quiet guilt and self-loathing that comes from feeling that your level of suffering hasn't earned you the right to feel so fucking hopeless. You just don't get that if the game moves at a more traditional pace. I'm not sure a feeling of aimlessness is achievable if Dagon descends from on high in a writhing mass of unspeakable hideosities within the first hour. For through so petrifying a visage, any man of stock would be led to the disquieting conclusion that he cannot roll over with the throngs of society and must cast himself into the abyss by the name Defiance, resolute in the ascension to the peaks of madness, comforted only by the cushion of macabre futility as you crest the climax, and at the center of it all he stands. Cold and uncaring, he who would gaze upon the indescribable horror of existence itself, born from the maw of a blind idiot god, and quoth the raven, "Get over it, bitch." Sorry, I'm getting off track. My point is, a combat system is only ever as good as it's used, and while this is where Hellblade gets most of its points, it's also where it really starts to lose them. I get what the intention was with flooding the late game areas with enemies, but fighting an ever-encroaching horde of demons constructed by your own mind that cause you physical pain and stand in your way at every turn is harrowing, while fighting 8 enemies in an enclosed space with a combat system designed for fighting maybe 3 is annoying. The grievances make a lot more sense when you consider the taste the game leaves in your mouth on exit, and I really wish they didn't, because little details like the voices occasionally correctly telling you when to dodge, along with a few other tricks I won't spoil, edge on brilliance in how they link the player to Senua by making you both trust and fear things that do not exist. In spite of anything, it's just great to see a more mainstream Western developer take the time to reason out a serious story about a much more mature subject matter than is common even in most indie titles into a genuinely engaging action game without ever feeling the need to draw a hard line in the sand about how this is somehow more than a game story, because it isn't. Art dies in pursuit of itself, and Hellblade works because it feels like the game Ninja Theory wanted to make, not the one they wanted praise for. It's by no means the most phenomenal story ever told, nor do I think it's the best possible use of the medium to tell a story, but it isn't so shackled to already existing forms of media that I could ever call the criticism I occasionally hear that it's a movie game fair. I don't even take issue with the term itself. There's a definite trend of games aping Hollywoodisms instead of playing to their strengths in the AAA space, but if you're gonna level that criticism at anything, at least pick one of the dozens of games that are transparent to the point of having the gameplay equivalent of turning pages. Fucking games being books and shit. If the crosshair isn't a prank and I can't learn tips and tricks from a dude named State Right, then what the hell are we even doing here? I'm a real man who plays real games, so buckle up because even the coroner's not gonna recognize what remains of Edith Finch by the time I'm done with her. Apologies in advance if you're one of the mentally disenfranchised who thinks this actually counts as a game just because it uses its settings, visuals, music, characters, levels, and mechanics to achieve what it's setting out to accomplish, but games are art now, so we finally get to be exclusionary, and you all know how much I I love T-ball. Now, obviously the argument here is that games maturing as an art form means that developers should have the freedom to explore stories atypical to the medium that take advantage of its strengths without being forced to contrive a typical gameplay loop that meets an arbitrary level of complexity. Well, according to some old game design textbook I couldn't find, games need both a fail state and a win state to be considered games. Yeah, technically a possible failure to achieve the win state is a fail state, but it isn't an active fail state, which the textbook might have specified. If I'm playing Dear Esther and get bored to the point of uninstalling, I didn't fail, I just played Dear Esther. I'm talking about real fail states, like dying, something Edith Finch obviously could have had, being a game about death and all, but no, it just had to go against that by making everything that would typically be considered a fail state a requirement to progress the story. Oh wow, big guy! Subverting the typical understanding and relationship that the player has with progression and failure built up through a lifetime of lessons and stories being hammered home for storytelling and theming purposes. Finishing college, ooh! I can already hear the cats hissing, so I'll get a bit more specific. After all, if I'm talking this much shit, I should probably actually cover the gameplay at some point. What Remains of Edith Finch follows the titular character as she revisits her old family home, which acts as the setting for what I'll call the framing half of the gameplay experience. It's pretty standard walking simulator fare, just making your way through delineated areas, looking around, and having bits and pieces of the story drip-fed to you via sultry voiceover. The rest of the game diverges a bit from the formula though, because as you explore the old Finch house, you'll find bizarre memorials to all of her dead Kennedys and play through vignettes of their final moments, each of which incrementally reveals more and more of the underlying story of a supposed familial death curse that has left Edith as the last woman standing. There's obviously a lot more to it than that if you pay close attention to everything in both the framing portions and the vignettes, but given the nature of the story, it's difficult to talk about anything without spoiling it. If you twisted my arm, I'd say the vignettes are the closest this game gets to existing. Each one is a different sort of minigame, where you're sucked into the shoes of each of the Finches through a variety of simple actions, some being far more engrossing and involved than others, but all getting across different points and clues for the larger story. So yeah, if you're willing to reach, maybe you can make the argument that these vignettes count, like an intentionally upsetting Mario Party for the lonely or something. But you absolutely cannot call the cerebral elements of the framing bits that offer additional information and perspective gameplay just because they require input, initiative, and actions from the player, because I'm not pressing buttons since the WASD keys don't count. And yeah, okay, maybe the structure only works in an interactive medium due to how it uses it, but for this to be a game, it has to be a challenge, which is an entirely different discussion than the one about how games designed around their difficulty shouldn't be forced to have difficulty sliders, by the way. Mandatory difficulty sliders impede artistic vision and freedom within games in a way that limits the art form, which is bad for reasons so obvious I don't imagine I need to explain them. I'm sorry, but it's really not that complicated, guys. Every single game shouldn't have to be for everyone. It's almost sad the level of desperation I've seen people reach trying to justify this kind of thing. One time a dude tried to tell me that the interactive elements in a game need to coalesce with its narrative setting and tone in a way that complements everything involved, and went on to claim that some stories and themes lend themselves to a more minimal style of interaction with a strict focus on observable detail in an environment that can't be so effectively and succinctly realized through any other media over any perceived need for mechanical complexity. As if experiencing and participating in the death of an infant from the first-person perspective wouldn't be improved in every way if I could do sick combos on the baby to min-max its lifetime. Maybe gameplay is a unique method of creating and amplifying the emotions that other media has on offer, but the emotional response to having executed said sick combos yourself is one wholly unique to games, and game writing sucks, so why bother? If you want to see the true value of games, just look at Tekken 7, a game where your skill is determined by your ability to master complex tech-based movement and develop an acute understanding of spacing, matchups, positioning, and execution. None of which are things I'm going to talk about because my skill level is about one rung above a controller and a tumble dryer, and that stuff is why I love to watch it, not why I love to play it. The reason I love to play Tekken is that getting knocked all the way down to the skill floor doesn't leave me with a sore ass the next morning because Harada was kind enough to carpet it for me. Besides, anyone with even a passing interest in fighting games knows what makes Tekken so good at the highest level of play by now, so instead I'd like to focus on what makes Tekken 7 so great at a level so much lower that it is effectively a completely different game. Like all fighting games, at its core Tekken is about execution, but unlike the majority of fighting games, it backloads that into movement and combo conversions rather than the character's individual moves, which is a design choice you can pick up on within your first few matches if you're paying close enough attention. When you load in, you're not met with 100 different flashing bars and UI elements all begging for your attention, meaning that you can focus on figuring out what all your buttons do rather than having an anxiety attack over what the fuck Mobus mode means. Oh, it's a 4-button fighter and each button is assigned to a limb. Got it. oh, I don't have to worry about getting blindsided by an anime OP since everyone gets one super around and you can tell when they have it without taking your eyes off of them. Got it. This is the sort of stuff that does double duty in making Tekken 7 both fun to play and fun to watch. You get to focus entirely on two people believably and skillfully kicking the shit out of each other without missing out on that anime bullshit wow factor because the game goes full on slow-mo on close trade final blows, which aren't just needless set dressing because they can whiff and always raise the stakes when they do. The level of hype the highest level players and casters express when this stuff happens at tournaments goes to show that everything Tekken does to make it easier to get into was accomplished in a way that doesn't lower the game's skill ceiling or otherwise allow it to be solved. Something evidenced further by the fact that a Bears main can win the World Tour and an oil prince can cause civil unrest in Korea without resorting to the traditional means. The game doesn't expect you to be overly familiar with the series prior to picking it up and sneakily guides you into enjoying it, and that's actually bled into the attitude of other players when they see people getting started. Don't get me wrong, they're not friendly, but we're fighting to the death in a marketplace, so I don't want them to be. I just want to be able to ask how to do an electric wind godfist without having my organs harvested. Legacy knowledge being a perk rather than an assumption also shifts the game's skill floor away from knowing a few more button inputs than your opponent and toward getting into their head, which I know for sure since I've never played this game against someone I wasn't talking to. Now, contrary to what you might think, spending the majority of my time with this game getting my shit pushed in by a smug, half-circumcised Portuguese man who should really stop key charging before somebody calls the IRS actually got me to appreciate everything about it even more. Getting stomped gave me something tangible to work toward, and it keeps those goals within my reach because the execution required doesn't look like War and Peace transcribed into Braille. You don't have to climb the entire mountain to feel like a badass, which is good for me since I don't imagine I'll ever be properly good at any game that requires hundreds of hours building muscle memory in practice mode and at least one tour of the Gaza Strip. Try as I might, I just haven't got the attention span to sit down and practice 1,000 combo conversions against Ragdoll Heihachi for long enough to pull them off consistently with my spaghetti hands, even knowing that doing so makes me do involuntary kegels intense enough to tone my taint. Unfortunately for my pride, that's not a flaw with the game, so there's nothing for me to pretend to fix. It's just an explanation as to why I gravitate toward games where the base mechanics are simple enough to memorize when they're first laid out, and the depth reveals itself as you learn more and more about how they function and intersect at a micro level. Which I guess doubly explains my love for Pyre, since an RPG visual novel sports game is pretty much intersection incarnate. It's also a pretty big divergence from Supergiant's comfort zone of isometric brawlers and isometric brawlers in other settings, and it's one I'm really glad they decided to take because they pulled off this bizarre combination pretty masterfully. All of the seemingly at odds elements of the game's design are tied back around into one another in really satisfying ways. The visual novel stuff adds a lot of stakes and drama to every write because you know who all of the people on the field are and you've spent the downtime developing relationships with them, which is heightened even further by the fact that losing a write doesn't hit you with a fail state or a do-over, you just lost. It sucks not only because you don't get to level up the players you fielded, but also because it negatively impacts their lives and your relationship with them, which isn't a level of depth I expected when I was told this was a sports game. Even though the mechanics of the rights feel pretty contrived, the game systems themselves feel so deeply intertwined with it that I'm not sure how to discuss any of the elements on their own, so I'm just not gonna try to. The basic setup for Pyre is that you and all the other characters have been banished from the Commonwealth to the downside, a sort of purgatory-esque plane of existence that can't be escaped by any physical means. The only way out of the downside is through a pseudo-tournament of matches pitting groups of exiles against one another, and at the end of each season, one person from the winning team is released back to the Commonwealth with all of their crimes forgiven. These matches are called rights, and they exist because someone at Supergiant realized there was a market gap for NBA Jam targeted at dudes who concealed carry D20s and mechanical keyboards. Within the rights, every character has different stats, moves, and point values associated with how they score, and each level up the more often you play them, and since you can only send your boys back to Boyville once they've reached a certain level of boyhood, that means you're not allowed to hoard the strongest players and dump the scrubs. At some point, you'll have to start playing everyone consistently, and when you start playing characters consistently, the game will start throwing you into more and more interactions with them, and the realization of how unique and likable every single person in La Squadra is makes liberation a fuckload harder because you simultaneously want everyone out safe, don't want to say goodbye, and don't want to weaken your team and hurt your chances to save the others. Everything is masterfully designed to complement everything else, which goes double for Darren Korb's obligatory perfect soundtrack. It's the most sonically diverse of any of their games without any track ever feeling out of place, instead giving off the impression that each of the disparate aesthetics are fighting for dominance alongside you while you kick Fido's teeth in. As for the story, it's not the most incredible tale ever told or anything, but it's all very well constructed and realized, and if you're willing to dig a bit deeper, it kinda reads to me as a literalization of Death of the Author. I know that at least one person watching this was invited to parties in high school, and the rest of you are still trying to change that, so give me a second to grossly oversimplify what that means. Death of the Author is a literary theory spawned by a 1967 essay of the same name written by the indefensibly French Roland Barthes, of which the central thesis is that the author's intent exists only within their own mind and not within the text itself, rendering it ultimately meaningless in the act of reading and interpreting the work. More specifically relevant to what I want to talk about is Barth's characterization of the author as a false god whose perceived ownership of the text must be overthrown by the reader, its true owner. The basic idea is that it's more valuable to determine what the text means than what the guy who wrote it meant, and that those things will often not line up between the reader and the author or even from reader to reader, so finding the true meaning of a work is inherently fruitless as it doesn't exist to begin with. Now that we've gotten all that boring shit out of the way, I guess the best place to start explaining how this relates to Pyre would be to point out that the player character, the one who pulls the reins and influences the direction and details of the story through action and inaction by overcoming the challenges proposed by the text, is literally called the reader, which the game specifically defines as one who can derive meaning from text. As I said before, the story of Pyre takes place in exile and exclusively features characters who have been cast out by a monolithic, seemingly all-powerful government. And while the simple liberation of your friends and party members is the initial driving force of the story, it's revealed pretty early on that their liberation is going to assist a coup that will usurp the Commonwealth and supplant it with a more democratic system. The likelihood that this will all be successful comes down to how well you can perform your readings during the rites, and spoilers until Chaz fucks off, the empowerment and liberation that you get as a reader doesn't come from your own freedom, it comes from your ability to free the text, as it's revealed partway through the story that readers are the only people incapable of being liberated by the rites, as, to those who hold power over this world, deriving meaning from the text is dangerous and unforgivable. This characterization of the systems that bind you and the rest of the exiles is extremely important, as the essay explicitly describes killing the author as counter-theological and properly revolutionary, stating that to kill the author is to free the text. You're not in this for the accelerated reader pizza party. You're here to topple the system that outlawed literacy in order to maintain its ownership of the text's truth. And how well you perform your readings is what determines your ability to fight back against that stranglehold on reality and determine the fate of the Commonwealth and its exiles. Throw on top that what happens to the characters, who they are, and what they mean to you are not set in stone. Everything is determined by you, both in how skilled you are as a reader and in how you interact and talk to them on the caravan, but also in how you view and interpret all of them yourself. Additionally, once you've freed a party member, they're gone. You don't directly see or hear from them again. The empty, uncertain finality that comes from finishing a book is directly written into the game's story several times over as you liberate your party members from both exile and the text itself. You're mostly left to assume until the game's credits give you a brief glimpse of where they are before ending properly and leaving you in that emptiness all over again. It's emotional and bittersweet, and the cherry at the bottom of the glass is that the song playing over the credits is altered to reflect what happened in your version of the game's story because the game concedes that that's the version that matters. This lens can even be applied to the game framing itself as a road trip story, as that mirrors the point in Big Daddy Barth's conclusion that the space of the writing is to be traversed, not penetrated. Fuck it, extrapolate one level further, and the fact that Pyre is a game at all works in this theme's favor, as it's possibly the art form that the theory is most suited to. The act of playing a game is a collaborative process between the developers and whoever happens to be playing it. You exist within the space of the text, and the minutiae of your experience will be unlike that of anyone else's, and at that point, who else could it possibly belong to? I don't know. Maybe it's all circumstantial. Maybe characters musing about the intentions of the scribes has nothing to do with anything, but I guess that's sort of the beauty of Death of the Author in the first place. It means I'm always right. When everything exists in this weird superposition of meaning, you can get away with interpreting shit like normal animals existing in a world of animal people as May having some dissociative disorder that causes her to view reality through a cartoony, childlike lens, likely as a coping mechanism for her mental illnesses and inability to grapple with her waning youth, if you're one of those people who's really into things like Dujana and cock. Granted, I'm probably more inclined to believe any interpretation that might add depth to something that so directly forced me to confront a lot of serious issues I'd been struggling with for years, issues that I had accepted were a part of me that was never going to go away and that I had resigned myself to someday die to. I know I've talked about it to death by now, but talking through and understanding why this game matters so much to me is something I need to do for myself, not anyone else. Night in the Woods touches on the importance of emotional availability, vulnerability, and overcoming the hurdles on the path there. And while personifying the more intangible issues as literally as the game does towards the end ooked me out at first, I get the impression it's written that way to suggest that the things we struggle with internally often seem more insurmountable than any physical barrier ever could. It's not a brilliant metaphor, but it's a good reminder that if you're in the woods when night starts to fall, then being able to drop your walls and let people in is just as important as battening down the hatches to keep the monsters out was to begin with. Nothing worthwhile was ever accomplished solo, and while haphazardly nailing planks to the windows is a sound solution in the short term, you're eventually gonna have to accept that you can't survive on oaks alone. I think that's one of the most compelling things about Darkwood as a survival horror game. It doesn't make the mistake that many games do of treating horror like a synonym for fear, and every facet of its design reflects that. The game starts by dumping you into a cursed forest and swiftly don't telling you it's deeply Eastern European, even more so than usual. I guess if you're already Polish, the only way to make a forest scarier is to make it Ukrainian. Regardless, it's enough to get my supple Angloid skin crawling right off the bat, and the game doesn't pull its punches from there. The best thing about Darkwood is the fact that, unlike what would seem like the obvious choice to make things scary, you're not alone in your quest for survival. The woods are full of characters for you to meet and talk to, but the game ensures that this isn't a comfort by making it clear that these people are not your friends, with the only names given to them being things like the Chicken Lady, the Doctor, or the Wolfman. It keeps you feeling like a stranger and creates a layer of anxiety about how these people might be taking advantage of you since you don't know how things work around here, a fact that more or less punches you in the face when you realize the only person you get a real name from is a child that you can manipulate for your own means. The lack of proper names is also probably one of the main reasons everyone describes the game as feeling like a dark fairy tale, which it does, but especially like a dark Slavic fairy tale. Think less Jack and the Beanstalk with a sword and guy liner and more Roadside Picnic meets The Hills Have Eyes. The game seems more focused on pulling you into the world and its residents than into its actual story, and this is another reason I think the horror works so well. If you want to go digging around to piece together the web of how each and every part fits into the others, you can, but in doing so, you'll find that the world itself is wholly unconcerned with you. You're not going to get a free pass because you're important, because you're not. And in realizing that you don't get to live because you're the hero, you're confronted with the very real idea that you don't get to live at all. That feeling of hopeless desperation, paired with the setting, storytelling, and mystery, give you a true sense of horror that's rare to find in any media, not just games. So the fact that it's all put on your back with the addition of the game's mechanics brings it to an entirely different level. Darkwood is a survival horror game in the truest sense of the word, as the game's horror is bolstered by the fact that seeing this through is on you, friendo, and since we're role-playing as a man who doesn't know what the strap of a watch is for, things are looking pretty grim from the outset. Now, there's something I've seen a lot of people question about Darkwood's design when it comes to being an effective horror game, and that's the perspective. A top-down game doesn't initially seem to have any of the advantages found in the common alternatives. It doesn't have the cinematic quality or lack of control of fixed cameras, the immersive nature of first-person, or the claustrophobia of a tight over-the-shoulder camera, making it a pretty strange choice for a game that's selling itself on atmosphere and a lack of jump scares. These people haven't played Darkwood. I don't want to spoil the things that make it work, because it's more effective the less you realize how the design is fucking with you, so I'll just recommend that everyone watching who hasn't played it yet fixes that, because it's damn near perfect. And it hurts me to say damn near, because the game as a whole pretty much manages it up until the final act drastically increases the amount of time you spend in combat and subsequently undercuts the tension. It's not even that the combat isn't good enough to support the shift, it's the fact that it being so good hinges on keeping you on the back foot and out of control. It's a pretty good example of why I don't think horror games are necessarily suited to a traditional difficulty curve. If you're raising the difficulty by increasing how often the threat of death is looming over me, I'm probably going to either figure out how to avoid it or otherwise grow numb to it, and at that point, the soft and wet thud of my shovel against an enemy's skull isn't the result of a clumsy, intense fight for survival, it's part of a combat encounter that started because a Smash player was in my way. I have zero doubt that Acid Wizard could design a great combat system without inundating the player with unnecessary mechanics that would break the survival horror stuff, but that's not the point. It doesn't need to be better, it just needed to stay backstage. I should probably clarify that this is, again, a really minor complaint that only stands out because of how strong everything else in the game is, and even then I'm probably grossly overstating it. It's not as if the game starts like Resident Evil 7 and then takes a handbrake turn into Hollow Knight at the 11th hour, though that would admittedly make the excessive combat focus a bit easier to swallow. It's a testament to how far games have come as an art form that a platformer about bugs made by 4 dudes who think sleep is some obscure country in the Horn of Africa managed to make an entire genre obsolete on a budget matching Sleep's GDP. Metroidvanias have always been a balancing act in adding complexity. Due to the basic rules of their design, it would follow that this has to increase in the mechanics provided to the player as the game progresses, but that line of thinking often leads to sets of tools that either overload the player with unnecessary and overly contextual options or create obsolescence within themselves as more and more options become available. Even worse, sometimes this will be combated by stretching the options far enough from one another that they can't reach the tipping point before the game comes to a close. And Hollow Knight deftly sidesteps all of this by rooting its complexity in modifiers of a smaller number of options while introducing new mechanics within the enemies and environment in addition to those added to the player's own arsenal. Outside of that, it doesn't really do anything super new and exciting on its own, but it executes the existing ideas it implements so flawlessly that it didn't really need to. It's not the most interesting thing in the world to talk about if you're a pretentious sack of shit like me, but the end result is a game I think a lot of people needed when it came out. Sure, the layout of the levels and the actual combat mechanics you have on hand are far from groundbreaking, but the work that could have been used to make them so was spent making sure they were the most refined version of what they were instead, which in turn made them good enough to carry the sheer weight of the absolutely absurd amount of content at hand, especially when you factor in the fact that this game is permanently on sale at $15. The amount and level of high-quality single-player content Hollow Knight has at this price is pretty much unprecedented, and even if some of that comes from repurposing its assets, it's done in such a way that only serves to improve the experience. It's funny how something so negative for some games can be the thing that sells others, and if you don't believe me, just look at how creatively and efficiently repurposing what was on hand made everyone lose their collective shit over sexy existentialism robots, beyond the other reasons implicit. If I'm being honest with myself, there's probably enough shit to talk about in Nier Automata to fill out an entire video of its own, but if I'm being honest with myself, I'm still not sure it's a good idea to talk so openly about super Japanese games. Not because of the games themselves or a hilariously misplaced sense of pride or anything like that, it's more about the sort of people they attract. I've gotten pretty numb to stupid comments by now, but given the opportunity, I'd still prefer not being sent to the realm dimension by a libertarian because at 3:31 I said something was written in kanji when any old braintard could tell you what was in daikatana. The only reason I'm being so reckless and talking about it now is that I don't think those people could make it this far without getting distracted by someone on one of their 16 Death Battle forum tabs implying that Seto Kaiba wouldn't use lethal force against the wild thornberries. And I guess the fact that Nier Automata is one of my favorite games of all time might also have something to do with it. Now, if I'm gonna gush over this game that I promise is about philosophy and existentialism, Mom, I actually want to start by talking about the combat because I was always warned that the combat is the weak link when I think the real problem is that it's very easy to make it one. Sure, you could stack health and regen implants to make it an exercise in sprinting headlong into a wall and crawling away to heal over and over if you want to, and doing so might even leave you in a state where you'd think it's fair to call the game the mind-numbing part of that equation. But believe it or not, there's a difference between a game egging you to optimize the fun out of your experience and you being shit, stubborn, and boring. Alternatively, you could recognize this logo and dump your chips into things like increasing weapon damage, movement speed, evade distance, crit chance, and adding shockwaves to your attacks, along with countering, bullet deflection, continuing combos through dodges, and fucking witch time. In doing that, you might find that you can't just mash light attack and tank your way through every fight, or run around in circles chipping down health bars with your pod. And now that you're awake, you might realize that every weapon class pairing in the game has 2 different unique sets of combos assigned to it, and that the game lets you pick 2 weapon profiles at a time. Weapon profiles, might I add, that you can hot swap between at any point during a fight based on what you need with a single button press. And then what do you know? You're hitting buttons! Don't have enough chipsets for everything you want? That's fine. Just remove your HUD and fucking ascend. The most effective way to play the game is both the most enjoyable and the hardest. That's the definition of a well-designed combat system. Even if you think I'm overstating its quality, I'd argue that the relative simplicity is a blessing in disguise since the core mechanics need to be translated and immediately familiar within about 1,000 different configurations of perspective and genre, something that's easy to forget if you get fixated on the pedigree. The only properly defined criticisms I have for it are that the difficulties don't scale very well, and the pod autofire and ranged options felt pretty bad, something that wasn't helped by my build being centered around carefully calculated Oonga Boonga, or the fact that playing on any difficulty higher than Delicates disables locking on, so you have to manually aim projectiles in a 3D environment with a thumbstick as a secondary focus in a game where the Oonga inputs are bound to the Boonga buttons. That second one's barely even a criticism. If you use the pod for shooting anything besides bosses and projectiles mid-combat, you're probably halfway through your third paragraph about why Donnie could definitely get the dual disc off in time. Now, assuming you're old guard enough to insist on ruining the gameplay for yourself, there's still a good chance you'll come away liking or even loving Nier, because if that brick wall didn't sap the last of your ability to recognize patterns, that's not what you're here for. You're here because Yoko Taro told you to meet at this location with 3 socks and a handgun. For anyone unaware, Nier Automata is the sequel to the secret 5th ending of Drakengard 1, the sequel to Drakengard 3, all of which were directed by the sequel to Humanity, Yoko Taro. The game takes place on post-apocalypse Earth after humanity retreated to the moon as a last-ditch effort to escape aliens who used machines to invade the planet after a dude named Kaim and his dragon fell through a portal with the Queen Beast, were killed by the Japanese Air Force, and infected the world with the Salt Plague. All of which only happened because the original planned ending, where the player squares off against a giant version of Ayumi Hamasaki in a singing competition to save humanity, was rejected. Most of that isn't directly relevant, but the English language doesn't contain the words to accurately describe Yoko Taro, so I figured I'd let the electricity in your brain do some of the legwork for me. Calling the man eccentric or weird or the manifestation of mankind's grotesque facility to eclipse reason doesn't really cut it. This entire franchise exists solely because he knew a lot of his fans hated the secret ending and thought that making it his next big franchise would be a funny way to fuck with them. He's my hero. All that might lead you to believe that Nier is a nonsense game that can only be fully understood after several playthroughs and hours buried in expanded universe novels, obscure wikis, and dissociative self-reflection. And it is, but not for that reason. If you look past all the Mask Man context, the story itself is actually pretty straightforward. So much so that I think it might be more worthwhile for me to just break down the prologue than to summarize the setup and give you a feel for the way it's actually written, because what you think of that is probably going to be the best indicator of how you'll feel about everything else. The game opens by fading in on some kind of ship accompanied by a monologue from the protagonist, 2B, about everything being designed to end, in spite of the fact that we're all trapped in a perpetual cycle of life and death. She goes on to wonder if this is a curse or some kind of punishment, and then wonders if we'll ever get the chance to kill the god who left us with this cryptic puzzle. You get joined by your boys, you get left by your boys, and you're swiftly introduced to a few of the different gameplay styles for the ship before immediately being kicked out and having to fight a few waves of enemies in an arena before a giant crane breaks through the wall and more than likely one-shots you. At which point, the game takes the credits on a ride with Destiny and boots your ass to the main menu, only for you to click continue game and fade in on a ship flying above the clouds accompanied by a monologue from the protagonist, 2B, about everything being designed to end, in spite of the fact that we're all trapped in a perpetual cycle of life and death, and it's clear that this isn't a curse or a punishment, it's a punchline. The game sends you back to this monologue every single time you die, and it takes 6 minutes to even reach the first point you reasonably can because the ship segments are piss easy and the opening is the only part of the game that doesn't let you skip cutscenes. Yoko Taro is repeatedly telling you to swallow your pride and change the difficulty, which is great enough in how actively he's trying to fuck with the player, but it goes a lot deeper than that. Not only are you explicitly told that this massive difficulty spike crane boss is completely unrelated to your mission, beating it reveals that your target is just a different giant crane boss, and beating him results in you dying anyways. Yoko Taro is telling you to your face that you only get to die when you do it the way he wants you to. He's letting you know he's God and is taunting you to try and kill him. A story about the human condition, existentialism, subjectivity, life, and death is using death as a means of telling its story in the opening moments, and it's doing it as a joke designed to piss you off. The story and how it's realized through the main and side quests in ways that only a game really can are without a doubt the most interesting things to talk about here, and that's exactly why I'm not going to do it any further. I meant it when I said I could fill out an entire video with this shit, and again, maybe I will someday, but for now, I'm here to recommend this game, not analyze it. Nier has big ideas that it explores in ways that are at worst interesting and enjoyable, and at best some of my favorite storytelling in the AAA space ever. And even if it has the typical anime problem where the longer a scene goes on, the probability that the characters will just start yelling the subtext at one another gradually approaches 1, it'd feel unfair not to lay praise on a game writer who can cover sweeping concepts about existentialism and the problems that arise within any kind of society or culture that thrives on conflict without just going, it's like a billion 9/11s. Video games are a relatively immature art form, and finding the language of them is going to take a lot more time than we've had. But that's part of what makes them such an exciting stepping stone toward the ultimate pinnacle of artistic expression. It's why seeing things that feel like a genuine evolution of the medium like this is so exciting, and it's why I want anyone who hasn't to see it for themselves. Sure, it doesn't come together quite as cleanly as Hollow Knight did, but the imperfections made it more human in a way that hits a lot closer to home. It made me remember why I fell in love with games in the first place. It made me feel like a kid again, and not just because the English dub occasionally dips into 4Kids territory. Granted, it's not really fair to pin that on the actors, since I'm not sure there is a way to deliver a mountain of dialogue with all the restraint and subtlety of Unit 731 naturally. And at the end of the day, it doesn't even really matter, because no amount of nitpicking is ever going to be enough to offset the immersion of Cube World Man trying to red pill me about genetic superiority. I guess I also could have just changed the voices to wingdings and sidestepped the issue altogether, but then I'd miss out on a few genuinely stellar performances and be faced with the cold reality that I have in fact become everything I've ever hated. In a way, I feel almost obligated to recommend Nier, since everything about it is just such fucking video games. Something that's extra impressive when you consider that a freak in a mask was just baiting you in with sexy robots so you'd listen to his TEDx talk about how reality is subjective and time is sand. The journey from what is this Japanese sexy robot bullshit to why is this Japanese sexy robot bullshit is one that I think ought to be taken. And on top of everything else, I have to respect a man who responds to the latter with, just like sexy robots. It's refreshing to see what can charitably be described as someone, knowing that nothing's gonna be helped by some weird explanation about how no, see, she needs to be naked because she breathes through her skin and that's very important for her character. Everyone knows the order those ideas came in, and it's honestly creepier when you won't just admit that you got caught in the middle and worked your way backwards. Why do you think you never see Kenichiro Takaki making shifty eyes about the advanced inertia and momentum-based martial arts being utilized in Senran Kagura Estival Versus?